Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be splitting my time with the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have the right to protest. Protest has long been part of our democracy, so important that we enshrined it in the Constitution, in the 4 fundamental freedoms enumerated in Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. All Canadians have the fundamental freedoms of conscience and religion, of free speech and expression, of association, and of peaceful assembly. The freedom to protest in the public square, whether on a sidewalk or in front of a legislature or in a public park, is a fundamental freedom. And so if Canadians individually or in groups want to protest by walking up and down Wellington Street or by standing around the Centennial Flame in front of Parliament, they are free to do so. Millions of Canadians over many decades have exercised this fundamental freedom. But what Canadians do not have the right to do is to blockade. There is no right to blockade. There is no right to blockade a street. There is no right to blockade a highway. There is no right to blockade an international border crossing. There is no right to blockade the construction of a new pipeline, nor is there a right to blockade a rail line. There is simply no right to blockade. And Canadians do not have the right to harm other people or to interfere with the freedoms of their fellow citizens. And while freedoms are fundamental, they are not unlimited. Freedoms are limited by what harm they do to other people, and freedoms are limited by how they interfere with other people's freedoms. Mr. Speaker, we are a nation rent asunder, West against East, rural against urban, those unvaccinated against the vaccinated. We are a nation divided because of a lack of leadership that begins at the top.
That's right.
The Prime Minister needs to reflect on the language and rhetoric that he has used over the past 6 months that has so divided this country. Rhetoric that has referred to over 3 million unvaccinated Canadians in disparaging terms. Rhetoric that suggests that those who disagree with him are not Canadian. Rhetoric that has poured rhetorical fuel on the fires of division that are pitting one Canadian against another, friends against friends, family members against family members, those unvaccinated against those vaccinated, those in favor of mandates against those opposed, those calling for an end to restrictions against those in favor of restrictions. And while many have fanned the flames of division in this country, they are not the head of government. They are not the Prime Minister of a G7 country. The Prime Minister's rhetoric in the last 6 months is unbefitting the high office of this land that he holds. Instead of bridging divides and reducing tensions and lowering the temperature, he has demonized the other. Mr. Speaker, it is time for the protesters to end the blockade in Ottawa and the blockade at the border crossing in Western Canada. It is time for the protesters to go home to their families and their communities. We have heard their concerns. We have met with some of them, and it is now time for them to go home. Their concerns have been heard loud and clear, and no doubt in the coming weeks, their concerns will be debated here on the floor of this democratically elected legislature. Mr. Speaker, Canada is a country founded on the trinity of a belief in freedom, a belief in democracy, and a belief in the rule of law. And in a free and democratic society, the rule of law must be upheld. In this case, the governments in this country have delegated the enforcement of the law against blockades to the police. I encourage the protesters blockading here in Ottawa and at our international border crossing to follow the direction of the police. In a democracy, only the state is authorized to use force, including lethal force, to uphold these fundamental freedoms that we enjoy, to uphold the rule of law. We have delegated this use of force to law enforcement. In our democracy, citizens are not entitled to use force. As citizens, we settle our differences through the ballot box or through the court system. We don't settle them through force. Mr. Speaker, we all bear responsibility for the current divisions in this country. We all have a responsibility to reflect on how we got here. I grieve for my country. Instead of peace, order, and good government, we have chaos, disorder, and poor government. And while many democracies are under pressure, both from domestic and foreign forces, Canada has been particularly buffeted by an inability to respond. The pandemic has laid bare the state of our institutions, and they are weak and ineffective. For most of the last year, we did not have a Governor General because of scandal. 8 of the most senior members of the Canadian military were forced out in scandal. The former clerk of the Privy Council resigned in scandal. We have a military procurement system that cannot procure, and we have payroll systems that cannot pay. And we have a parliament that cannot do its job because the government defied 4 orders of this House and its committee for the production of documents. We have a debates commission that ran in the last 2 elections what is almost universally acclaimed as the 2 worst set of election debates since election debates were first held in this country in the 1968 election. The People's Republic of China interfered in the last federal election and spread disinformation through proxies, leading to the defeat of several candidates, and nothing has been done. We have some of the highest levels of household indebtedness in the world, and governments in this country are not far behind. Less than 2 years ago, some provinces in this federation had trouble raising cash on debt capital markets to pay police officers and nurses, and the federal government had to step in to bail them out. We have the 2nd worst healthcare system amongst leading economies of the OECD, according to the Commonwealth Fund. Greenhouse gases continue to rise each and every year that this government has been empowered, to a record high level in 2019, the last year for which we have data. And in the early months of this year, it looks like we will once again break through records with record high levels of emissions. We haven't met our NATO commitments in decades, and now Russia is about to invade a democracy in Eastern Europe. And now we have a national capital in paralysis, and the seizure of an international border crossing, the hallmark of a sovereign state. Mr. Speaker, we have gotten to this place because we have not been serious. We have not been serious about the rule of law. We have not been serious about ensuring our democratic institutions reflect the diversity of views in this country. We have not been serious about domestic policy. We have not been serious about foreign policy. Mr. Speaker, it's time we got serious.